filmmaker. A long time ago, but a filmmaker who was very active in first organizing the Toronto independent film community as well. He was the founding director of the Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Centre in one life, but in other lives he has been a historian of English diaries, a author of plays of curious historical character, most recently a prequel to Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, which was playing last week at Theatre Passe-Muraille. Rob has a few things to say about the context for this film, so please join me in welcoming Rob Fothergill.
Whoa. Thank you. There. Yes, I had a play on just last 2 weeks. And when people knew I had a play on, they said, as people do, break a leg. So I did. I'm still hobbling about. Anyway, I don't need to stand behind a lectern, do I? I'm not quite sure what this group consists of, and I'm not quite sure why this film, so-called, of mine is part of it. I say so-called because it wasn't really a film at all. It was made on 2-inch black and white videotape, imagine videotape that size, in the TV studios at York University in the summer of 1970. Some remote scenes in it were shot on 16mm film, transferred to tape and edited into the final thing. It was finally shown on CBC, National Network and affiliates in September 1970, and might have made a bit of a splash, except that events overtook it. I'll talk about that in a bit. What I want to say something about is the context of the making of this film. Some of you will clearly remember the context of the making of this film, some of you will not. May of 1970. And if this was a much younger audience, I would say we're talking about half a century ago, which is really hard to imagine. When I was 20, half a century ago would have been the outbreak of World War I. And so when you sort of think, how far back is such and such? So to this young lady sitting at the front here, 1968, 69, 70, your parents were born then. But on the other hand, I remember it as though it was yesterday, and so do some of you. And I want to say something about the shift in climate in Canada from the early 1960s to the late 1960s. I only came to Canada in 1963, went to McMaster and did an MA there, and things led one to another. So it was extremely presumptuous of me to make this program, given that I hadn't been here very long. I didn't know very much, really, but one does presumptuous things at that age. But if you think of the earliest 1960s, Canada was governed by John Diefenbaker and the Conservatives, and the United States was led by John Kennedy and Camelot and all that excitement and glamour and interest. And Toronto was a very dull place. It was closed on Sunday. It was a grey, Protestant, rather uptight city, getting more interesting. I mean, the riverboat was probably open on Yorkville by 1963. But I think it's true to say that for most young people, Canada didn't seem like a very interesting or exciting place, and if you wanted interest and excitement, you went to New York. By the end of the 1960s, we had Pierre Trudeau and they had Nixon, and they had the war in Vietnam and the riots in Watts and Newark and Detroit, and people could sit on the Windsor side of the river and watch Detroit burning, and thousands of young Americans were coming to Canada to get away from what the United States was turning into. We'd had Expo in 1967, which made Montreal seem like the most exciting, sexy, swinging, inviting place in the world. In the early 1960s, what did Canadian culture... Is that Bruce? Hello, Bruce. What did Canadian culture consist of in 1963? How many people here could name 3 Canadian playwrights published and performed in Canada before 1967? Name 3. No offers? Can you name 3 or 4 Canadian feature-length Canadian movies? Bruce can, Stephen can, before 1965. There were some. 1963, Claude Jutras À tout prendre, Winter Kept Us Warm, Bitter Ash by Larry Kent, and there was a fourth one that I can't remember now. Nobody Wave Goodbye, I guess. Who were the Canadian novelists of the early 1960s? Callahan, McLennan, Gabrielle Roy. When did Mordecai Richler write his first novel? Pretty early 1960s. Favorite Game by Leonard Cohen was 1963. There wasn't much going on. By the end of the 1960s, there was a tremendous amount going on, and there was a surge of Canadian national sentiment, both cultural and political and economic. There was a sense that Canada was coming out of its rather dreary period from the 50s into the 60s, and also that it might be in danger of somehow sliding into incorporation into the United States. George Grant's book, Lament for a Nation, I think is as early as 1965, isn't it? Sometime, anyway, mid-1960s. I mean, the very title, if you remember George Grant, Lament for a Nation, is a sort of elegy for a Canada which he felt was gradually slipping away, a Canada which was, I mean, for George Grant, who was a conservative theologian, philosopher at McMaster, it was a Canada of conservative values, white, Protestant, but it was a Canada that might have been able to get out from under the influence of Great Britain without falling under the influence of the United States. And George Grant felt that that was not happening. By the end of the 1960s, no, let me go back one sentence. In the early 60s, I think a lot of people would have felt if Canada finally joins the United States, well, why not? I mean, we're halfway there anyway. What's the big difference? We watch all their television, we watch all their movies, we read all their books. We don't have much of any of that ourselves, so why not? Anecdotally, after this program was made, I met in Vancouver a Canadian citizenship court judge, of all things, a man whose job is to confer citizenship on new immigrants, who said wouldn't have bothered him if Canada had become part of the United States. Big deal, doesn't really matter. And I thought, a Canadian citizenship judge could say this. But by the late 60s into the 70s, there was, all of a sudden, the great founding novelists, Margaret Atwood, Margaret Lawrence, Mordecai Richler going full strength. Playwrights in 1967, you had Les Belles Sœurs from Quebec and Ecstasy of Rita Joe by George Rieger. By 1970, Passe Muraille was up and running. It's celebrating its 50th anniversary next year. Within a very short time, Factory, Free Theatre, and what's the last one? Tarragon were going. Factory was committed to producing only Canadian plays. And yet before 1967, nobody, I think, in this room, unless you were being very shy, could remember a single Canadian playwright. Robertson Davies. Which?
Merrill Dennison?
Merrill Dennison, even the 1920s. Herman Voden in the 30s. Gwen Farris Ringwood. There is a name to conjure with. But there wasn't... You couldn't go to the theatre in Toronto in the early 1960s. Well, you could. You could go to the Crest. You could go to the O'Keefe Centre and see a travelling production of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead. What I'm saying is there wasn't much going on. By 1970, there was a terrific amount going on, and some of it was a very strong national self-assertion. We have to own our own industry before the Americans buy all of it, and resource sector and transportation sector, banking sector. Big debates about writing and publishing Canadian textbooks for schools and universities, quotas on hiring Canadian scholars. There was a very funny event at York once in the Senate of York. I've been at York since shortly after the Korean War, when there was a debate about whether York should have a hiring priority quota for educated, Canadian-born, I guess, scholars. And all the Brits in the Senate, of whom there were quite a lot, including me, were saying, yes, of course we should. Canada has got to assert its sovereignty and hire Canadian. All the Americans in the Senate, and there were a lot of Americans at York at that time, were saying, no, it's got to be open, free competition. And the relatively few Canadian faculty members at York were kind of looking anxiously from one side to the other, which is right. And it seemed... Anyway, the immediate context for making this program was the Chicago 7 trial, which was in February of 1970. The 7 guys who were arrested after the riots in Chicago Democratic Convention, August 1968, made a wonderful farce of the trial. Bobby Seale, Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, a number of other people, names I can't remember at the moment. And something about that trial made me feel, as if it made any difference, we have to do something, you know. And quite quickly the idea of this film came to me as a dramatization, as you will see, if you don't know already, of the night that Canada finally loses its sovereignty and becomes part of the greater United States of America, done in a kind of documentary, realist, you know, live event style, with people who were very prominent in their day. The thing is anchored by Stanley Burke, who was the Peter Mansbridge of his time. Remember Stanley Burke? Barbara Frum interviews 3 Canadian academics, Abe Rothstein, Stephen Clarkson, Michael Cross. Larry Zolf is in it, talking to Barry Callahan, son of Morley. There's a situation flashback to a previous Canadian Prime Minister announcing that he's setting in motion the legal procedures which will incorporate Canada into the States. It is assumed that Quebec has become a sovereign nation. The thing I regret about this is if I'd thought about it and tried harder, I could have got René Lévesque into it. Bet I could. He would have participated in this program. But didn't occur to me, or I tried and couldn't or something. Tried getting George Grant, but he said he'd talked too much already about this, find other people. People were very interested and willing to participate. The program seemed to be to them a vehicle to express their sense that Canadian sovereignty was in peril, economic, cultural, political, and this program seemed to be a vehicle for them to express that. It's not interesting as film. It's somewhat primitive technologically and stylistically. Cost us, I think, $2,500 out of pocket money to make. Now that's because we were making it in the studios at York University, so it didn't cost us anything. The university decided to back it and, you know, give us the run of the place. I think that's all I want to say, really.
Thank you
Haven't
very
seen it for years and years myself. I hope it doesn't.
Thank you.
Thank you, Will.